Welcome to True Crime Audio Pod, where we unravel the threads of the most disturbing true crime stories. In today's story, we delve into the chilling case of Carolyn Warmus, a former schoolteacher whose life unraveled into obsession, scandal, and murder. Convicted in 1992 for the fatal shooting of Betty Jeanne Solomon, her lover's wife, Warmus's trial captivated the nation with its tales of illicit affairs, mysterious evidence, and media comparisons to Fatal Attraction. Decades later, questions linger about the evidence, the motive, and whether justice was truly served. The pre-dawn darkness clung heavily over the Georgian-style mansion, shrouded in a cold ocean mist that had crept inland, wrapping the San Diego suburb in silence. Inside, an intruder, a shadowy figure moving with an almost spectral stillness, ascended the grand staircase, each step an omen of what was to come. In the master bedroom upstairs, Dan and Linda Broderick lay deep in slumber, unaware of the peril creeping closer. It was Sunday, November 5th, 1989, and the couple had planned to enjoy a leisurely morning in the safety of their elegant home. The room, adorned with the kind of luxury that spoke of their prosperous lives, held no sign of the horror about to unfold. The intruder slipped through a rear door to the bedroom, the latch turning soundlessly. The figure paused near the headboard, gazing down at the couple. Linda, clad in a delicate, sheer nightgown, was nestled beneath the colonial print bedspread, her slender form curled against her husband's side. Dan, a prominent attorney, radiated confidence and success even in sleep. The two, strikingly attractive and seemingly invincible, were utterly defenseless. A faint creak of the floor betrayed the figure's presence. Dan stirred, his instincts sharper than his dreams. Linda's eyes fluttered open, registering the intruder at the same moment. Panic ignited in her chest as she screamed, her voice piercing the stillness. "Call the police!" Dan's reflexes kicked in. He reached for the phone on the bedside table, but the milliseconds he had were not enough. The room erupted in chaos as the .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver in the intruder's hand barked its first deadly blast. The hollow-point Hydra shock round, designed for maximum destruction, ripped into Dan's back. The slug tore through flesh, shredding his right lung, splintering a rib, and leaving him gasping as he crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. The assassin did not relent. Orange flashes illuminated the room, the air choking with acrid smoke. A second shot cracked the wooden nightstand beside Dan. Another tore into the wall above the bed, missing its target by inches. But the next two rounds found Linda, ending her life in an instant. One bullet entered the base of her skull, burrowing deep into her brain. The other plunged into her chest, narrowly avoiding her heart but delivering a fatal wound. Her body fell limp, her screams silenced forever. Dan, still alive but gravely wounded, struggled for air. His hand instinctively reached for the phone, the last lifeline to the world outside. The figure stepped closer, watching with cold detachment. Bending down, the killer ripped the cord from the wall, severing any hope of rescue. The phone, now useless, was discarded near the top of the stairs. As the figure disappeared into the shadows, Dan remained on the floor. His breath came in wet, gurgling gasps, the life draining from him with each passing second. The once safe haven of the Georgian mansion had become a tomb, the tranquility of the night shattered by the violent echoes of murder. At 7:30 a.m. on the crisp morning of November 5, 1989, a concerned knock echoed in the quiet neighborhood of San Diego. An attorney and close friend of Dan Broderick stood on the doorstep of the Georgian-style mansion, worry etched on his face. He wasn't alone. Vern Curry, another acquaintance of Dan's, had also tried to reach the Broderick household several times but had met only silence. Alarmed, the two men decided to investigate. The mansion, perched overlooking a forested canyon, stood locked and still. The front door didn't budge, and the back entrance was similarly secured. Unease grew as the two split up, circling the house in search of a way inside. It was the attorney who spotted the open window. He called out to Curry, and together, they pried off the screen and climbed through, their movements tentative but determined. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. Sunlight filtered through large windows, casting long shadows in the opulent interior. Everything on the ground floor appeared untouched, orderly, a stark contrast to the men's growing sense that something was terribly wrong. Their voices echoed hollowly through the silence as they called out for Dan and Linda. No response. They hesitated at the base of the grand staircase, a sense of foreboding hanging heavily in the air. Slowly, they ascended. On the plush carpet near the top, the attorney's eyes fell on something odd, a phone with its cord violently severed. He gestured to Curry, and together they approached the master bedroom, the knot of dread tightening with every step. The scene awaiting them would forever be etched into their memories. The sprawling bed was no longer a symbol of comfort but one of horror. Linda Broderick lay face down, her delicate frame motionless and stained with blood. Nearby, Dan's body rested on the floor, his lifeless eyes staring into nothingness. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. The men later described the scene as surreal, their minds struggling to process the grisly tableau. Some blood was their initial report, an understatement that belied the reality. The attorney moved quickly, kneeling by the bodies to check for any signs of life, but there was no mistaking the truth. Dan and Linda were dead. Unable to use the phone upstairs, Curry descended to find a working line and summon help. Within minutes, the call reached Detective Sergeant Tom Calloway, head of Homicide Team Number 6. By 8 a.m., officers and paramedics began arriving, the once tranquil neighborhood now a flurry of activity, yellow police tape sealing off the scene. Detective Carlyle W. Mathena, a seasoned investigator with 17 years of experience but new to the homicide team, was among the first to step into the house. His partner, Detective Terry DeGelder, joined him shortly after. Together, they ascended the stairs, their keen eyes scanning the details of the crime scene. Linda's body bore 2 visible wounds, one in her chest and another in the back of her head. Dan, sprawled on the floor, had a fatal wound in the middle of his back. As they carefully moved Dan's body, the detectives discovered the bullet that had passed completely through him, its deadly trajectory ending on the floor. A second bullet was recovered beneath Linda's lifeless form, buried in the blood-soaked bed. The wound at the back of her head lacked an exit point, leading the detectives to conclude that a third bullet was lodged deep within her skull. They also retrieved a 4th slug from the nightstand and located the 5th, which had pierced the wall, embedded on an exterior landing. The evidence painted a grim picture. The torn phone cord on the floor was matched to the ripped wires dangling from the wall near the bed. Prints were meticulously dusted across surfaces throughout the house, though no weapon had been left behind. The detectives worked methodically, cataloging each grim detail as the house revealed its secrets, step by agonizing step. By mid-morning, the once silent mansion had become a hub of investigation. The haunting question lingered in the air: who had turned this elegant home into a brutal crime scene, and why? For the detectives, the answers lay hidden among the blood, bullet holes, and shattered lives. The investigation gained momentum as the morning wore on. While Detectives Mathena and DeGelder meticulously examined the blood-soaked bedroom and directed the work of crime scene technicians, a third member of Homicide Team 6 arrived. Detective Felix Zavala, a seasoned investigator with years of experience navigating the grim intricacies of homicide cases, joined the effort. By 9:30 a.m., Zavala began his first interviews, sitting down with the attorney and Vern Curry, the two men who had stumbled upon the bodies earlier that morning. The men recounted their unsettling discovery. They described how repeated calls to Dan Broderick's home had gone unanswered, leading to their decision to check on the couple in person. Finding all the exterior doors locked, they had shouted into the house, desperate for a response. The silence had been deafening. Finally, spotting an open window, they tore off its screen and climbed inside. Their unease had transformed into horror when they reached the upstairs bedroom. Zavala shared his findings with Mathena and De Gelder. The detectives quickly concluded that the killer had not entered through the same window as Curry and the attorney. Every exterior door of the house had been locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. The chilling implication was clear: the murderer had used a key to enter, and had locked up carefully before leaving. The timeline of the murders began to crystallize thanks to two neighbors, who independently reported hearing gunshots at approximately 5 a.m. The detectives now had a clearer window in which the brutal killings occurred. With motives still a mystery, speculation turned to Dan Broderick's high-profile career. Dan had amassed a small fortune suing doctors in medical malpractice cases, a lucrative but contentious field. His annual earnings reportedly exceeded $1 million, a fortune that may have fueled admiration, envy, or vengeance. Was it possible that one of Dan's courtroom adversaries had obtained a key and orchestrated the murders in an act of violent retribution? As they probed deeper, the detectives sought to better understand the victims. With help from Dan's attorney friend, they pieced together a portrait of Daniel Thomas Broderick III and his new wife, Linda Bernadette Colquhoun Broderick, a story steeped in ambition, controversy, and, ultimately, tragedy. Dan Broderick was no stranger to success. Born into a large Catholic family, he had cultivated a relentless drive from an early age. By 1973, he was working for a prestigious law firm in La Jolla, a glamorous enclave north of San Diego. His star rose quickly. After graduating from Harvard Law School, Dan chose to specialize in medical malpractice law, a decision that proved immensely profitable. His sharp legal mind and ruthless determination earned him a reputation as one of the best in the business. But it also made him enemies. Despite his professional triumphs, Dan's personal life was marked by complexities. His marriage to Linda Colquhoun was his second. Decades earlier, in the mid-1960s, Dan had been an awkward young man with sideburns and round glasses, studying at the University of Notre Dame. It was at a football party during this time that he first encountered Elizabeth, a stunning blonde from New York who would later become his first wife. The meeting was unremarkable at first. Dan, trying to make an impression, handed her a slip of paper with his name written out, followed by the enigmatic initials MDA. Elizabeth, curious but unimpressed, asked, "What does that mean?" With a confident grin, Dan replied, "Medical doctor, almost. Next year, when I graduate from Notre Dame, I'm going to New York for medical school." Elizabeth remained skeptical, but their paths crossed several more times that weekend. Though she wasn't immediately taken with him, Dan's persistence ultimately won her over. Their early connection would lead to a relationship, a marriage, and eventually a bitter unraveling, but that was still years in the future. Now, decades later, the detectives faced the aftermath of Dan's second attempt at building a life, this time with Linda Colquhoun, a former airline stewardess turned legal assistant. The couple's union was as controversial as it was short-lived, shadowed by Dan's acrimonious divorce from Elizabeth, a divorce that left scars on all involved. The circumstances of his first marriage, and the events leading to his second, would soon become pivotal threads in the unraveling mystery of the murders in the Georgian mansion. Dan Broderick's infatuation with Elizabeth and blossomed into an all-consuming pursuit. After their initial meeting during his college days at Notre Dame, Dan remained captivated. He stayed in close contact with her once she returned to New York, and when he relocated to Manhattan for medical school, he intensified his efforts to win her over. By then, Dan had begun to shed his earlier awkwardness, evolving into a more polished and ambitious young man, foreshadowing the charismatic figure he would later become. Elizabeth, known to friends and family as Betty, came from an affluent Catholic family in New York. Her upbringing instilled in her a firm belief that success required hard work, despite the privileges her family's wealth afforded her. Betty herself was no stranger to diligence. She often worked as a model and embraced an active lifestyle that included archery, horseback riding, and shooting. She was vibrant, driven, and socially engaged, qualities that only deepened Dan's fascination. By the late 1960s, their relationship had become a serious romance, even as both juggled demanding academic pursuits. Dan was a struggling medical student, and money was perpetually tight. Betty, with her greater financial stability, often paid for their dates and provided her car for transportation. For the young couple, these challenges didn't matter. They were deeply in love, and their bond seemed unshakable. Eventually, Dan proposed. Betty accepted, and on a spring day in April 1969, they were married in a ceremony at the Immaculate Conception Church. The wedding, though traditional in setting, reflected Dan's unconventional streak. Eschewing a tuxedo, he walked down the aisle in a blue pinstriped suit of his own, a choice that symbolized his confidence in carving his own path. From that day forward, he affectionately called his new bride Betty. Their newlywed life, however, was a stark departure from Betty's comfortable upbringing. While Dan's parents covered the cost of his medical education and basic living expenses, the couple's finances were stretched to the breaking point. Betty, accustomed to maids, country clubs, and designer clothing, found herself in a cramped dormitory room where she was expected to take on the roles of cook, cleaner, and caretaker. The lifestyle shift hit her hard, and the once bright optimism of their romance dimmed as she struggled to adjust. Betty's disillusionment grew, and at times she considered walking away from the marriage. But her resolve hardened when she discovered she was pregnant with their first child. Determined to make their marriage work, she stayed, eventually giving birth to 4 children during the course of their union. Dan's career took an unexpected turn after his graduation from medical school. Recognizing his knack for argumentation and his interest in medical issues, he decided to pivot to law, specializing in litigation within the medical field. It was a bold move, but one that would set the stage for his meteoric rise. By 1973, with 2 children in tow and a law degree in hand, Dan relocated the family to San Diego, California, where opportunity awaited. The city's courts were inundated with lawsuits, and Dan's combination of medical knowledge and legal acumen proved invaluable. He quickly established himself as one of the most formidable malpractice attorneys in the region. His reputation for success grew as he won case after case, earning accolades in both the legal and social spheres. Dan's victories in the courtroom were more than just professional triumphs. They opened doors to San Diego's elite circles. Wealth and prestige followed, and Dan was soon seen as not only a legal powerhouse but also a prominent community leader. In San Diego's competitive social landscape, success bred influence, and Dan Broderick seemed to have it all. But beneath the surface of his rising empire, cracks in his personal life began to form, foreshadowing the turmoil that would later engulf the Broderick family. By 1976, the Broderick family had settled into the opulent seaside enclave of La Jolla, California. Perched along the glittering Pacific, their new home offered a breathtaking ocean view, stunning architecture, and a coveted place among San Diego's upper crust. For Dan and Betty, this move symbolized the pinnacle of their success. It was a lifestyle marked by cocktail parties, charitable galas, and neighbors with equally impressive resumes. 2 years later, in 1978, Dan made a bold move that would further cement their status in the elite social circles of La Jolla. He left his law firm to establish his own malpractice practice. It was a calculated risk, but one that paid off handsomely. With this entrepreneurial leap, the Brodericks enjoyed a windfall of wealth and privilege. They became members of prestigious country clubs, drove luxury cars, took first-class trips to exotic locales, and provided their children with the finest private school education. Their home featured a private swimming pool, a symbol of their enviable life. Dan even ascended to the presidency of the local bar association. Betty, meanwhile, relished her return to the lifestyle of her youth, a life of glamour, comfort, and affluence. But beneath the glittering surface, the Broderick marriage began to crack. The couple's arguments, once over trivial matters, became more frequent and bitter. Dan, whose life increasingly revolved around his burgeoning legal empire, spent long hours at the office. Betty, feeling isolated, withdrew into her role as a mother, her frustrations often boiling over into squabbles with the children. Her threats to leave the marriage became more frequent, though she never followed through. Dan, now entrenched in his work, found excuses to spend even less time at home. The divide between them widened. In the spring of 1983, a turning point arrived. Dan, needing assistance for his expanding practice, rented a luxury office suite tailored to attorneys and hired a new employee, Linda Kolkina. At just 22 years old, Linda was a strikingly beautiful blonde with a magnetic presence. A former Delta Airlines flight attendant, she had little experience in the legal field but seemed to captivate Dan from the start. It wasn't long before rumors began to swirl. Colleagues whispered about Dan and Linda's growing closeness. One acquaintance later admitted that he had provided the pair access to a hotel room on several occasions during late 1983. To those observing from the periphery, the nature of their relationship seemed undeniable. The whispers eventually reached Betty. Suspicions gnawed at her, and she confronted Dan directly. He denied any impropriety, brushing aside her accusations. Betty, however, was not convinced, and her suspicions festered. The tension reached a boiling point on November 11, 1983, Dan's birthday. Hoping to surprise her husband, Betty arrived at his office with plans to celebrate. What she found instead was another party already underway, in Linda Kolkina's office. To her disbelief, both Dan and Linda were absent. Betty waited, but they never returned. Furious and humiliated, Betty stormed home. In a fit of rage, she gathered Dan's clothes, piled them in the backyard, and set them ablaze. The flames mirrored the growing animosity between the once golden couple. The fallout was swift and brutal. The hostility between Dan and Betty escalated, spiraling into a cycle of resentment and retaliation. During a trip to New York, Dan delivered a devastating blow. He no longer loved her. Betty was shattered. When the couple returned to San Diego, the fractures in their marriage deepened. Dan arranged for Betty and the children to live in a rental house while repairs were made to their family home. Months later, Dan moved back into the house, but alone. Enraged and feeling abandoned, Betty drove to the family home in a frenzy. What followed was a destructive outburst of epic proportions. Overcome with anger, she shattered mirrors, smashed glass, and spray-painted graffiti across the walls, marking the home with her fury. What had once been a picture-perfect marriage had devolved into a volatile battleground, setting the stage for one of the most infamous domestic dramas in San Diego's history. The Broderick saga was no longer a story of love and success, it had become a powder keg waiting to explode. In September 1984, the once promising marriage between Dan and Betty Broderick officially crumbled when Dan filed for divorce. What followed was not a mere legal proceeding but a vicious war, marked by bitter custody battles and escalating animosity. The couple's 4 children became pawns in the fight, their lives upended by their parents' unrelenting conflict. Betty, determined to make Dan share in the responsibilities of raising their children, began dropping them off unannounced at his residence. She hoped this would force him to adjust his high-powered lifestyle. Instead, Dan hired a series of housekeepers to care for the children, solidifying his ability to retain custody. Betty, already resentful of what she perceived as Dan's growing detachment, saw this as yet another affront to her role as a mother. Over the next 5 years, the divorce proceedings transformed into a protracted and bitter war. The courtroom became a battlefield where both parties sought to land the final blow. Betty, convinced that Dan's influence as a prominent lawyer gave him an unfair advantage, grew increasingly agitated. She believed the legal system was stacked against her, leaving her powerless to compete on equal footing. The frustrations of her legal losses only fueled her fury. The battle extended beyond the courtroom and into real estate. Dan, eager to move forward with his life, wanted to sell the family home in which he was still living. Betty, however, refused to sign the necessary paperwork, forcing Dan to take extraordinary measures. With a judge's intervention, an order was signed to authorize the sale. The home was sold at a disappointing price, which only deepened Betty's outrage. Dan attempted to pacify her by purchasing a new Ocean View house for her in La Jolla, but it was no consolation. To Betty, it was a reminder of what she had lost. Financially, Dan provided generously for Betty. Her monthly spousal support began at $9,000 and eventually ballooned to $16,000, a staggering sum by any standard. Despite this, Betty refused to work, even though she held teaching credentials and a real estate license. She insisted that the settlement was inadequate and remained consumed by what she saw as Dan's manipulation of the system. Her fixation on his perceived injustices left little room for personal growth, though she did maintain a romantic relationship with a male companion during this period. Meanwhile, Dan's life moved in a different direction. By 1989, his relationship with Linda Kolkina had become official, and the two decided to marry. He purchased a luxury home in the exclusive Marston Hills neighborhood, where they planned to begin their new life together. The couple married in April 1989, just weeks after Dan's divorce from Betty was finalized. The ceremony, held on the front lawn of the Marston Hills estate, was a picture of affluence and new beginnings. But a dark shadow loomed over the event. Betty, unsurprisingly, was not invited. Amid the lingering bitterness and acrimony, a friend quipped that the newlyweds might do well to wear bulletproof vests, a suggestion that felt less like a joke and more like a grim acknowledgement of the venom that had defined the Brodericks' divorce. What should have been a fresh start for Dan and Linda carried with it the weight of unresolved tensions, a volatile history, and a growing sense of danger that no one could yet fully grasp. The war between Dan and Betty may have reached a legal conclusion, but the emotional battle was far from over, and its ultimate cost would soon become terrifyingly clear. Homicide Team Number 6 had spent hours combing through the Brodericks' Marston Hills home, piecing together the grisly puzzle of the double homicide. Theories swirled. Could it have been a vengeful doctor, furious over a malpractice suit Dan Broderick had successfully argued? Or was the killer someone closer to home? But the deeper the investigators dug, the more one name kept surfacing: Betty Broderick. The urgency to locate Betty intensified when Detective Carlyle Mathena interviewed Vern Curry, one of the two men who had discovered Dan and Linda Broderick's lifeless bodies. The conversation with Curry unveiled a bombshell, one that would transform the case from a mystery into a damning indictment of a bitter, broken relationship. Detective Mathena began the interview with standard questions about the discovery of the crime scene. Curry, a longtime acquaintance of both Dan and Betty, seemed cooperative. But then he let slip a detail that took the investigation in an entirely new direction. Curry admitted that he had been romantically involved with Betty Broderick for years. On the night before the murders, Betty had invited him over to her La Jolla home for dinner. She seemed calm, Curry recalled. Not upset, not agitated. We'd just gotten back from a 4-day trip to Acapulco the weekend before. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then Curry dropped the revelation that electrified the investigation. Early on the morning of the murders, at around 7 a.m., barely 2 hours after the estimated time of the killings, he received a call from a mutual friend, Tanya Stone. According to Curry, Tanya was frantic. "Betty just phoned me," Tanya had said. "She told me she'd been over at Dan and Linda's house." Curry, still groggy from sleep, didn't immediately grasp the significance of Tanya's words. But her next statement jolted him awake. "Betty said she had a gun with her," Tanya continued. "And some shots were fired. She's calling me from a phone booth, and she's saying something about contemplating suicide. Something about not having enough bullets left in the gun." Curry pressed for details. "Where was she calling from?" he asked. "I don't know exactly," Tanya replied, her voice laced with anxiety. "It sounded like Claremont." The revelation was staggering. Not only had Betty Broderick admitted to being at the crime scene on the morning of the murders, but she had also implicated herself in the shootings, however indirectly. The phone call from a booth in Claremont, a neighborhood not far from the murder site, added weight to her confession. Her mention of suicide suggested a desperate state of mind, but the lack of bullets in the gun pointed to another chilling possibility: she had used them all on Dan and Linda. For Mathena and the rest of Homicide Team Number 6, this was the breakthrough they needed. The evidence of Betty's mounting rage, combined with her alleged confession to Tanya Stone, shifted the focus of the investigation. The specter of the discontented doctor or random assailant began to fade. Instead, the story of a deeply fractured marriage, long-simmering animosity, and a final, explosive act of violence came into sharp focus. Now, more than ever, the detectives needed to find Betty Broderick. As the walls closed in around her, the question became not if she had committed the murders, but why, and what had finally driven her over the edge. As Detective Mathena continued his conversation with Vern Curry, the investigation's pieces began falling into place, revealing a grim picture. Curry, visibly shaken, recounted how he had initially tried to call Dan Broderick after receiving Tanya Stone's alarming phone call. When his attempts to reach Dan failed, he rushed to the home of Dan's attorney friend, and the two men went together to the Broderick residence. What they found inside would haunt them: the lifeless bodies of Dan and Linda Broderick, victims of a violent and calculated act. "I knew she had a gun," Curry told Mathena, his voice weighted with unease. "She used to go to a target range. She mentioned before that she was good at it, said she could shoot a gun pretty well." While Mathena worked to follow this lead, Sergeant Calloway dispatched Detective Richard Allen, another member of Homicide Team 6, to Pacific Beach to question a relative of Betty Broderick. The relative, a young woman, provided a crucial breakthrough in the case. She admitted that Betty had called her early that Sunday morning, around 6:30 a.m., rousing her from sleep. This call, Allen noted, came within 2 hours of the estimated time of the murders. Initially, the relative's answering machine had picked up the call, but hearing Betty's voice, she had picked up the phone. Betty's words were chilling and to the point. "She told me she was in trouble," the girl said. "She said she had shot Dan." The young woman then revealed a startling detail. Betty left her purse here earlier, and I saw a gun in it." Detective Allen, his pulse quickening, asked to see the purse. With the relative's permission, he opened it and found a 5-shot Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver, the same caliber weapon used in the murders. Taking the gun into evidence, Allen pressed for more information about Betty's call and subsequent visit. The relative began piecing together the shocking events of that morning. According to her, Betty had phoned from a telephone booth in Claremont. Her voice was trembling and low, as if she were afraid someone might overhear her. She said, "I'm in a telephone booth in Claremont. I'm in trouble. I shot Dan. I shot the son of a bitch, and I'm on my way over to your house." Betty sounded scared, nervous. Then she said, "If I don't show up, the cops will have found me." And she hung up. Minutes later, Betty arrived at her relative's house, visibly distressed. Her first words were a panicked shout, "I've shot Dan." The young woman, horrified, tried to make sense of what Betty was saying. She bombarded her with questions. Where? How many times? What did he say? Betty's responses were disjointed and frantic. "I don't know," she stammered. "I don't know if I really shot him. It was dark. I didn't hear anyone scream. But Dan said, 'Okay, you shot me. I'm dead.' Then he fell off the bed." As she continued speaking, Betty described her actions at the crime scene with disturbing detail. "I pulled the phone off the wall," she admitted, confirming the detective's earlier findings at the Broderick home. When asked how she had gained access to the house, Betty revealed that she had used a key. She said she tried the front door, but it wouldn't work, the relative recounted. So she went around to the back, used a key to open the door, and went upstairs, through the television room, into their bedroom. Detective Allen left Pacific Beach with the revolver and a mountain of incriminating information. With each new revelation, the case against Betty Broderick became increasingly damning. Her own words painted a picture of a methodical and deliberate act, driven by years of simmering resentment and a devastating obsession with her ex-husband's new life. The focus of the investigation was now clear. Betty Broderick was no longer a person of interest, she was the prime suspect in the cold-blooded murders of Dan and Linda Broderick. The hunt for answers had become a hunt for Betty herself. The details of Betty Broderick's actions in the hours following the murders painted a picture of desperation and calculated chaos, as recounted by her relative during questioning by Homicide Team 6. According to the young woman, Betty had gained entry to Dan and Linda's house using a key she had obtained from one of her children. Dan had recently changed all the locks specifically to prevent Betty from accessing his home, but he had given a key to one of their daughters. Somehow, Betty had managed to take it. "She told me she took the key," the relative explained, "and used it to get into the house. She went through the back door and into their bedroom through the TV room." Amid Betty's frantic ramblings after the murders, she had expressed concern for her 2 sons, who lived with Dan and Linda. "She wanted me to go to the house and check on the boys to make sure they were okay," the relative said. Betty also claimed Dan had sent her legal papers the night before, threatening to have her jailed. What happened next? A detective pressed. "My boyfriend and I left Betty at the apartment and drove over to Dan's house to check on the boys," she admitted. But there was more. Betty had asked her relative to retrieve a security box containing papers, a personal phone book, and some other items. However, when the pair arrived at Dan's house, they found the police already there, investigating the crime scene. The officers asked if I had seen Betty Broderick, the girl confessed. "I told them no, I hadn't seen her, that I was just there to pick up my laundry. Then we left." After leaving Dan's house, the couple returned to the apartment where Betty was waiting. There, the relatives said, they debated what to do next. Betty made several phone calls, appearing increasingly nervous. Finally, they decided Betty should turn herself in to the police. They drove to the San Diego police station in La Jolla, but along the way, they picked up Tanya Stone, the friend who had received Betty's alarming call that morning, and another of Betty's friends. Once at the station, the group sat in the parking lot, discussing their options. "We decided Betty should hire an attorney before going in," the relative explained. Betty then asked her to return to her home to collect personal items, including diaries, a phone book, and index cards, and bring them back to the station. When the young woman arrived at Betty's home, she was surprised to find Detective Richard Allen and other investigators who had earlier been at Dan and Linda's house. "They thought it was strange we'd been at both places," she said. "So, they asked us to get in their car and come downtown with them. We did." At the downtown police station, the detective's questioning grew more intense. The relative eventually admitted she had seen the .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver in Betty's purse before. "She told me she kept it in her pocket," the young woman revealed, and said, "If Dan gives me any shit, I'm going to get him." Detectives also learned that Betty had gone shopping with her relative on Friday, just 2 days before the murders, and had shown no signs of anger or distress at the time. But it was Betty's conversation with Tanya Stone on Sunday morning that further solidified the case against her. "Yes, Betty called me," Stone told the detectives. "It was sometime between 6 and 7 in the morning. She said she was calling from a phone booth in Claremont. She sounded upset, frantic. Betty's words were both chilling and erratic. She told me, 'I need help. I don't know why I'm calling you. I'm sick, nauseous, and upset, and I need to be with somebody. I just came from Dan's house, and I may have shot somebody. It was dark, and I couldn't see anything. If there was another bullet in the gun, I would have used it on myself.'" At the police station, Betty's anxiety reached a breaking point. She repeatedly tried calling attorneys but struggled to reach anyone on a Sunday morning. Finally, she managed to contact a lawyer who agreed to meet her. Later that day, accompanied by her attorney, Betty Broderick walked into the police station and voluntarily surrendered. For Homicide Team 6, her surrender brought the focus of their investigation to a dramatic conclusion. The question of who had committed the murders was now answered. But the motivations, the deep-seated rage, and the years of emotional turmoil leading to that deadly morning would soon become the centerpiece of one of the most infamous criminal trials in San Diego's history. The retrial of Carolyn Warmus began in early 1992, with many familiar faces returning to the courtroom for another round in the ongoing legal battle. Judge Carey once again presided over the proceedings, and Assistant District Attorney James McCarty reprised his role as the lead prosecutor. The prosecution's case still leaned heavily on the testimonies of Paul Solomon, the husband of the murder victim, and private investigator Vincent Parco. However, this time, Carolyn Warmus had a new defense attorney, William Ehrenwald, a renowned legal strategist who replaced her former lawyer, Lewis. Warmus, whose appearance had drawn attention during the first trial for her provocative choice of miniskirts, adopted a more subdued look for the retrial. She now appeared in demure dresses, presenting a restrained demeanor. Despite the change in her appearance, the core of the testimony and evidence was a near repetition of the first trial's proceedings. But this time, the prosecution had an explosive new piece of evidence, a black knit woman's glove. This glove had been photographed by forensic teams at the crime scene, lying near Betty Jeanne Solomon's lifeless body on the bedroom floor. Yet, during the first trial, the glove had mysteriously disappeared, leaving it absent from the initial proceedings. Before the retrial, prosecutors had asked Paul Solomon to search his apartment, where he had lived with his wife at the time of her murder, for the missing glove. To their astonishment, Solomon reportedly found the glove tucked away in a box within his home. On March 31st, ADA McCarty introduced the black knit glove into evidence, sending shockwaves through the courtroom. He described it as potentially significant, pointing out flecks on its surface that were suspected to be blood. However, McCarty admitted that the flecks had not been tested to determine whether they were blood, let alone if they matched the victim's blood type. Despite the lack of definitive forensic analysis, the glove became a focal point of the trial. Adding to the drama, a relative of the Solomon family testified that the glove was strikingly similar to a pair she had once borrowed from Carolyn Warmus in 1989. The relative described the gloves as soft, black, short in the fingers and long in the wrist, aligning with the characteristics of the recovered glove. This testimony further linked Warmus to the mysterious item. As the evidence mounted, Judge Carey granted a week for defense attorney Ehrenwald to prepare his response to the prosecution's introduction of the glove. But the situation took a dramatic turn when McCarty dropped another bombshell just as Ehrenwald was about to deliver his argument. The district attorney's office had obtained Warmus's credit card records, which showed she had purchased a pair of gloves closely resembling the one found at the crime scene. The transaction had taken place at Filling's department store in 1987, 2 years before the murder. Ehrenwald erupted in fury, accusing the prosecution of sandbagging him with the last-minute revelation. His frustration was palpable as he argued that the evidence was circumstantial at best. Our position, Ehrenwald declared, is that even assuming there was some evidence that Ms. Warmus purchased a pair of gloves similar to Exhibit 272 in 1987, that is not sufficient to establish that 272 is the glove at the crime scene. If they can't do that, the fact that she may or may not have purchased a similar pair of gloves is irrelevant. The defense argued that the glove's provenance was murky and its sudden reappearance suspect. They challenged its connection to Warmus, insisting that without a direct link to the crime scene or forensic testing, the prosecution was relying on conjecture. The glove, a single item of evidence, became a lightning rod for controversy in the courtroom. Both sides knew its implications could sway the jury, underscoring how pivotal this trial would be in deciding Carolyn Warmus's fate. Once again, the tragic murder of Betty Jeanne Solomon and the shadowy motives of those involved took center stage, with the black knit glove as a chilling symbol of the unresolved mystery. On April 13, 1992, Judge Carey delivered a ruling that would shape the course of the trial. He allowed the black knit glove, now infamous for its late reappearance, to be introduced as evidence. For the first time in the 2.5-year-old case, a piece of evidence directly tied Carolyn Warmus to the scene of Betty Jeanne Solomon's murder. The glove became the linchpin of the prosecution's argument, a tangible connection in a case that had relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. The courtroom drama reached its peak as the trial concluded. On Thursday, May 21, 1992, nearly 13 months after the first jury had deadlocked, the second jury received the case. Their deliberations were painstaking, lasting a full 7 days. Yet, seasoned court observers noted a difference this time, a sense of focus and professionalism in the jury's discussions. Their demeanor suggested that progress was being made. Finally, at noon on May 27, 1992, the jury forewoman led her colleagues into a tense and expectant courtroom. Moments earlier, word had spread that the jury had reached a verdict. As the forewoman stood to deliver the decision, the room fell silent, its occupants collectively holding their breath. The verdict was clear and final. Carolyn Warmus was found guilty of second-degree murder and possession of an illegal weapon. A gasp rippled through the gallery, a mix of shock and satisfaction from those who had followed the case so closely. Carolyn Warmus, who had remained composed throughout the trial, maintained her calm demeanor even as the weight of the jury's decision settled over her. Then came the unmistakable metallic sound of handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists. As they were secured behind her back, the quiet but firm voice of the court officer broke the silence. "Let's go." At just 28 years old, the former teacher and once glamorous figure was led out of the courtroom and into custody, her fate sealed. She was transported to jail to await sentencing, scheduled for June 26. Under New York law, the penalty for second-degree murder was clear: 25 years to life in prison. Outside the courthouse, defense attorney William Ehrenwald faced reporters. His tone was resolute as he announced plans to appeal the verdict. As far as circumstantial evidence cases go, this was not a weak case by any stretch of the imagination, Ehrenwald conceded. Warmus was obviously shocked and disappointed by the verdict. To the very end, she expected to be acquitted. "My client continues to maintain her innocence." Meanwhile, Assistant District Attorney James McCarty, who had spent years pursuing justice in this case, spoke with a quiet sense of closure. "I was relieved the case was finally over," he admitted. "You always feel a little sorry for all the people in a case like this." The final chapter unfolded on June 26, 1992, in the Westchester County Courthouse. Carolyn Warmus, now a convicted murderer, was brought before the judge to receive her sentence. As expected, she was handed the maximum penalty, 25 years to life in prison. Thus concluded a case that had captivated the nation, a sensational saga marked by jealousy, betrayal, and murder. It joined the ranks of the most chilling and dramatic crimes in New York's history, leaving an indelible mark on the annals of American true crime. Carolyn Warmus remains incarcerated under inmate ID #92G0987 at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women, serving her 25 years to life sentence for the second-degree murder of Betty Jeanne Solomon. A disciplinary history report released in January 2017 revealed that Warmus had committed 11 infractions during her time in prison, all of which were affirmed. Her first parole hearing took place on January 9, 2017, exactly 25 years after her incarceration began. Warmus was represented by attorney Mayor Morgan Roth during the hearing, but her request for parole was denied. The decision was likely influenced by the severity of the crime and her continued assertion of innocence. In 2004, Warmus alleged that she had been sexually abused by prison guards and filed a federal lawsuit against the New York State Department of Correctional Services. She claimed she had been raped and forced to trade sexual favors for basic privileges. On April 15 of that year, Lieutenant Glenn Looney, a corrections officer at Bedford Hills, was charged with second-degree sexual abuse after Warmus provided officials with a sample of his sperm that she had kept refrigerated in plastic. In 2008, the Department of Correctional Services agreed to settle the lawsuit, awarding Warmus $10,000. On the day Warmus was sentenced in 1992, her attorney announced a $250,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of anyone responsible for Betty Jeanne Solomon's murder. Betty's sister publicly dismissed the offer as bogus, stating that the evidence against Warmus was overwhelming. She expressed her preference for a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Following Warmus's first trial, the Scarsdale School Board came under public pressure to remove Paul Solomon, the victim's widower, from his teaching position. Solomon's courtroom testimony about his multiple extramarital affairs had stirred controversy. In September 1991, the board reached an amicable agreement with Solomon and the principal of Greenville Elementary to reassign him to non-teaching duties. On November 17, 2016, Warmus returned to court to dispute legal fees with her former lawyer, Julia Haidt, whom she sued for malpractice. Warmus claimed that Haidt mishandled her appeal by failing to pursue DNA testing on the glove evidence from the murder scene. She demanded $80,000 in returned fees and an additional $320,000 in compensation. Her current attorney, Mayor Morgenroth, stated that Warmus hoped to secure her release from prison to undergo surgery for a brain tumor. In March 2018, Warmus sat down for an interview with the team of Crime Watch Daily to discuss her case and the enduring media coverage of the trial. When asked about her portrayal in the media, Warmus responded, "Nothing in the media portrayed me well. Had they just focused on the truth and the facts, it would have been a different story. But I guess that doesn't make a sexy story to sell in the media." The interviewer noted that Warmus had once been described as the type of woman a man would want to bring home to his mom. Warmus smiled at the comment, replying, "That was sweet. Yes. I was like the girl next door." Despite her charm, Warmus continues to insist on her innocence. She claims that Paul Solomon manipulated her into a trap to deflect suspicion from himself, portraying her as an obsessive and emotionally unstable woman capable of murdering his wife. "Do you think he was trying to frame you?" the interviewer asked, leaning forward. "Absolutely. Absolutely," Carolyn replied without hesitation, her voice steady and firm. Carolyn Warmus's amorous past, marked by obsessive relationships and at least 2 restraining orders, painted a troubling picture that contrasted sharply with her claims of innocence. When asked about the restraining orders during her Crime Watch Daily interview, she offered a measured explanation. "One couple said they had to get a restraining order against you." "Is that true?" the interviewer pressed. "We did a reciprocal restraining order," Warmus explained. "That he was not going to come near me, my family, the office, or anything like that. So that's what that was about. Nobody wants to describe it in its entirety." The conversation then shifted to the prosecution's alleged motive for the murder of Betty Jeanne Solomon. Paul Solomon said that he and his wife were planning to get divorced. "So what would be the purpose? What would be the gain, the benefit for me?" Warmus questioned, her voice tinged with incredulity. "It's not even something that I would consider. I mean, that's like out of a soap opera." The interviewer summarized the lack of direct evidence in the case, so there is no forensic evidence, no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon? "Right," Warmus replied. "It was a completely circumstantial case." The infamous glove, photographed near Betty Jeanne Solomon's body and later vanished, underscored the prosecution's reliance on circumstantial evidence. The comparison between Carolyn Warmus and Glenn Close's character in Fatal Attraction was then raised. "Were there any similarities?" the interviewer asked. "He was a married man." "That was the similarity," Warmus said, her tone dismissive. "So what did you think of that comparison, and how much do you think it prejudiced your case?" "Oh, I think it was huge prejudice, Warmus answered emphatically. "They tried the case in the media." When asked about allegations that private investigator Vincent Parco sold her a gun, Warmus flatly denied them. "Did Vincent Parco ever sell you a gun?" "No." The interviewer pressed further, "What about the gun Parco said that you had told him you threw over a parkway? Did you ever dispose of the gun?" "I never had a gun to dispose of," Warmus responded firmly. The controversial call made to Ray's Sports Shop in New Jersey also came under scrutiny. "Did you make that call to Ray's Sports Shop?" "No. I don't even know if that call was made," Warmus replied. "But the bill that the prosecution got from the phone company showed that call from your home," the interviewer countered. Warmus pushed back, claiming discrepancies in the evidence. "Right, and then the second bill, first of all, it wasn't bills, it was like computer records. Then they got a second statement which showed another discrepancy. So they introduced 2 computer copies or something that actually contradicted themselves. And then there was the actual hard bill, the printed bill on paper. So one of those bills was a fraud? Or an error or something, Warmus said. When asked about the moment she learned of her unanimous conviction, Warmus admitted she was stunned. "I was just in shock. I was just in shock," she said. "Did you kill Betty Solomon?" the interviewer asked directly. "Of course not. Absolutely not," Warmus insisted. Warmus claimed the interview could serve as her final testament. Despite the jury's verdict and Detective Constantino's steadfast belief in her guilt, there are those who maintain Warmus's innocence. One prominent supporter is Jeffrey Deskovic, a man who himself had a wrongful rape and murder conviction overturned by DNA evidence. Deskovic, who now uses his multi-million-dollar compensation to advocate for others he believes are wrongfully convicted, counts Warmus among those deserving of justice. "I try to look to the future. I try to look forward. I try to look at the bright side," Warmus said, ending the interview with a sense of resolve. Carolyn Warmus was eligible for parole again in the summer of 2018, but she requested a postponement. As she continues to battle the effects of a brain tumor and awaits a potential court ruling on an appeal to overturn her conviction, the story of Carolyn Warmus remains unfinished. And so, the story of Carolyn Warmus, a tale of love, betrayal, and murder, continues to stir debate and intrigue. Convicted yet steadfast in her claims of innocence, her case serves as a haunting reminder of the complexities of justice and the enduring shadows cast by obsession and tragedy.